Okay, it seems like we've gotten enough people in here, so I just wanted to say good morning. My name is Melissa Nemeth, and I will be moderating today's webinar. And today's session will be on preparing for the 2022 ACA filing season, brought to you by us, Trusaic. And so before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items. First is today's webinar is being recorded, and we will send all registrants a link to view today's recording along with a copy of all the slides. And then during the presentation as well, if you have a question for the presenters, you can use the Q&A feature and we will answer all the questions at the end. So be sure to put them in the Q&A and not the chat. So without further ado, I will introduce you. Oh my God. To our presenter, Maxfield Marquardt, Trusaic's Associate Director of Regulatory Affairs. Maxfield serves as the Associate Director of Regulatory Affairs and brings over a decade of regulatory compliance experience with a specialization in ACA and pay equity at the company. And at Trusaic, Maxfield assists with IRS penalty letter correspondence, ACA compliance evaluations, and other regulatory needs. He received his Juris Doctorate from Pepperdine University Crusoe School of Law and a master's in dispute resolution from the Strauss Institute of Dispute Resolution. So I will turn it over to Maxfield to take it from here.
Good morning and/or good afternoon to everybody. Welcome. Thank you for attending. Let's dive right in. The ACA upcoming filing season. I know the favorite time of year of all of our HR partners and clients. ACA is heading into a really strong open enrollment period. The uninsured rate is very low right now. ACA exchange participation rate is at the all-time high, and that means one thing for a lot of our clients, and that's that a lot of their employees are getting issued PTCs, which increases the risk of penalties, right? ACA is receiving a lot of funding. States are expanding coverage. There's a lot going on. So I'm going to dive into a few little pieces here. But again, as she mentioned, if you have any specific questions, please put them in the Q&A section. I'm happy to address them at the end. If they're complex, I'm happy to address them afterwards in email format with any of you. So please fill up the questions. If we could go to the next slide. Okay, so some of the key drivers of the ACA right now. First, there are a lot of provisions of their Inflation Reduction Act that have driven a lot of things in this area at the moment, right? Special enrollment periods as well. There's been a lot of additional government funding, both at the state and federal level, outreach, hence the very, very low, very high enrollment rate, I should say right now. Longer open enrollment periods, and then the big elephant in the room, COVID-19, drove a lot of people to seek coverage during this period of time. So I was going to rewind a little bit after introducing the Inflation Reduction Act, because we're going to talk a little bit about the American Rescue Plan that was passed in March of 2021. The American Rescue Plan was really kind of important in this area for a couple of reasons. Primarily, it expanded PTC eligibility, right? So it expanded PTC eligibility to individuals with income below 150% of the federal poverty line. Those individuals could end up obtaining coverage for as little as $0 a month. So there's a strong incentive for any of those individuals to sign up in an exchange. In addition, it increased the range of subsidized coverage, right? So subsidized coverage can now go to individuals up to 400% of the federal poverty line and even beyond, right? In addition, it ensured that the maximum contribution for benchmark coverage could be no more than 8.5% of household income. That's huge. That means that for a lot of people, if they're comparing their employer plan to their exchange plan, the exchange plan is going to be cheaper, right? Which means you're going to drive a lot of people towards the exchange that would otherwise have enrolled or been offered coverage under an employer plan, right? It also waived, repayment of excess PTCs received during 2020. So again, a lot of things in here were driving factors that were pushing not just individuals who weren't receiving coverage through their employers, but even individuals that were being offered coverage through their employers. And as a result, and we'll go over the numbers a little bit later in the presentation, right, there's been a significant increase in the number of PTCs being given out by the government. Oh, so there we go. So I kind of already just went over this quickly, but just a reiteration, right? So American Rescue Plan, March of 2021, really expanded PTC eligibility, and it capped coverage costs in the exchange for individuals, driving a lot of people towards the exchange. Pauline, if I could get the next slide. Right. So again, what does this mean? Right. Greater eligibility for subsidized coverage through the ACA exchange means more PTCs are going to be issued to individuals, less employer-sponsored coverage enrollment. More PTCs means one thing, right? More PTCs means that there's more opportunity for employers to end up with a letter 226J assessing them an ESRP penalty, right? The employer shared responsibility penalty, right? So PTCs, as a reminder for everybody, are the trigger for the IRS, right, to essentially take another look at how you're coding your 1095Cs, right? Obviously, right, you're coding, your employees aren't getting PTCs, it almost doesn't really matter, right? Because they're not getting PTCs, there's no trigger, right? But as soon as you've got those PTCs, that's going to trigger that PB penalty, and we're seeing a lot of that. Pauline, if I could get the next slide. So the Inflation Reduction Act, right? So the Inflation Reduction Act passed in October of 2022. This did a couple more things that we believe are going to dramatically increase not just the extent, but also the speed of IRS enforcement over the next coming years. One, it expanded PTC eligibility under the prior act passed in March of 2021 through 2025. That was previously going to end in this coming year. But now we've got at least 2 additional years of that, and who knows that it could extend even further, right? Allowed Medicare prescription drug cost negotiation, which hopefully is going to bring coverage down a little bit. It curbed PTC costs, but the big elephant, if you will, the biggest part of that bill that we think is going to dramatically increase both the speed and scope of IRS enforcement is the funding that went to the IRS, right? $80 billion of funding for IRS tax enforcement, including the ACA. In previous years, we've seen huge lag times between when the IRS would issue, say, a non-filer initial letter, the 5699, and then the follow-up 5005A, where they're actually proposing a penalty, and then the actual CP series letters where they're actually assessing the penalty. There could be months, if not years, of lag time between those letters. That timeline's already decreasing, and we think it's going to decrease even more with the extra funding going to the IRS. That, and they're going to have more time to scrutinize employer responses, which means that timely filing your returns for the next coming years is going to be just that much more important. Pauline, if I could get the next slide. All right. So, as I just mentioned, right, extend PCD eligibility through 2025. More IRS funding means more tax enforcement. We're estimating, somewhere in the vicinity of 87,000 new tax agents. This is just going to lead to more penalties and more rigor in the IRS auditing what employers are sending into them. Next slide, Pauline. In addition to the big reduction acts, the new IRS regulations have finally kind of fixed that family glitch that everybody kind of noticed, where now it's extending PTC eligibility to individuals' spouses and dependents. Again, just another thing that's going to increase the possibility of individuals getting PTCs and therefore triggering employer penalties. If I could get the next slide, Pauline. So as I said, just kind of going over the numbers, right? Premium tax credits for 2022 so far, right? So we're looking at enrollment in the different exchanges at this point in time, right? At the federal level, we're looking at about 14,500,000 people, with 89% of those people receiving a PTC, right? So total percentage of individuals receiving a PTC that are enrolled in the exchanges is incredibly high, right? So lots of individuals being driven to the exchanges due to legislation passed during the COVID time period. And most, if not almost all of those individuals are getting PTCs, which is going to just dramatically, again, I can't emphasize it enough, increase the potential for penalties later on, both substantive ones and then obviously late filer penalties as well. Pauline, if I could get the next slide. Again, just a little overview of overall numbers for all of you guys in the 3 big states that always get the most. This is, again, you know, this slide, while the numbers themselves change year to year, the overall emphasis is pretty consistent, right? The 3 biggest states where we're seeing PTCs are California, Florida, and Texas. Florida, obviously the largest. But again, those are the big three, if you will. So for all of you that have employees in those states, just know that those exchanges are incredibly, they have lots of open enrollment periods. There's a lot of activity there, and a lot of PTCs are coming out. I'll let you take away with the polling question there, Pauline.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and launch our first poll. And the question is, have any of your employees received a premium tax credit from a state or federal health exchange? I will give it just a minute for everyone to respond. All right, it looks like we have our responses. And I will share the results of this poll question with the team. So 19% of you said yes, 29% said no, and 52% of you said, I'm not sure.
That's not a surprising result to me. Obviously, whether or not an employee receives a PTC is not necessarily something that you're going to be privy to at any given time. In fact, often the only way you're going to know that your employee received a PTC is if you do get an IRS penalty letter and they're proposing an ESRP based upon those PTCs. So that's good for you. That means that 50% of you have not received that kind of a penalty letter, such that you would know that your employees are receiving the PTCs. So let's get back to kind of what we were talking about before. What do all of these ACA changes mean for employers, right? And it just means that with increased IRS funding, with expanded eligibility to PTCs, that the stakes for 2022 and beyond are that much higher, right? So employers need to be diligent in their 2022 annual filings, right? One, please note, and many of you use this in the past, some of you might not even know about it, but the IRS has finally eliminated good faith transition relief. Also, the IRS has placed a significantly larger amount of scrutiny on late filing. In years past, again, as I said, the time frame between receiving your 5699 saying, hey, we think you should have filed, we don't have a record of you filing, to getting that 5005A where the IRS is saying, hey, we're going to propose some penalties against you. And then again, the time frame between that and receiving a CP series letter where the IRS is actually assessing the penalties was long. And often if you got that 5699 and you responded to it with a filing, the IRS left you alone. Well, It used to be in years past that even when you got to the 5005A, you could sometimes just simply file and the IRS would leave you alone. We're seeing an increasingly large number of our clients that are getting these letters that come to us after getting these letters, where we'll complete the filing for them. And then the IRS is following up and saying, hey, now you need to give us reasonable cause to show why we should not assess the penalty. I really don't have enough time in this short presentation to go over what reasonable cause means. No, it's the standard that the IRS uses for any late filing, whether it's your ACA filing, whether it's your quarterly tax returns. And essentially the gist of it is that you need to show that there was something either outside of your control that caused this late filing to occur, that you reasonably relied on another professional that was reasonable for you to rely on in order to do the filing, and or you have a really great track record of filing on time, and this was just some sort of errant blip that you fixed completely right afterwards, and it'll never happen again, kind of thing. As a reminder, there is no statute of limitations for either of these penalties. So just because the IRS might have forgotten about you or misplaced for a particular year doesn't mean they're not going to come back later. There's going to be a lot more IRS scrutiny, again, on ACA filing, simply because the IRS is going to have more resources to place towards this. We have a feeling we're going to see fewer and fewer ACA filing extensions. You know, in the first few years, those are pretty standard as everybody was getting used to the system. But the IRS at this point in time expects employers to already know what they're supposed to be doing and when they're supposed to be doing it. Next slide, please. If everyone hasn't seen it yet, this is your 2022 1095-C form. It's almost identical to your 2021 1095-C form. It's out there on the IRS website. Go take a look at it, make sure you've got it downloaded. There shouldn't be any questions for people who have already been doing the filing regarding what these different boxes mean. Obviously, if you need any assistance with this, understanding what this form means and what it looks like, please reach out to us. There we go. Now, the IRS did propose. Now, my caveat here is going to be that right now we're looking at the draft instructions for 2022 that have added these two codes. We're pretty confident that they're final and that these two codes are going to be in the final instructions. But if you haven't seen the draft instructions, they are up on the IRS website at this point in time, and I don't expect there to be any changes to them. So if you haven't taken a look, please go on the website, grab a copy of the instructions. Goes over all of the new coding. So these two new codes directly relate to HRAs, which is where all of the coding kind of additions have been in the last couple of years, right? Since 2020, if you will, right? So the first one is used when the individual and the spouse, it's 1T, individual and their spouse received an HRA offer of coverage, and the affordability was determined using the employee's primary residence zip code. IU is where it's the same type of coding, but where you're using the employee's primary employment site zip code, affordability safe harbor, right? So if any of you are not familiar with kind of the activity around HRAs over the last couple of years, you know, the big development coming into 2020 was the rules and regulations that essentially established that HRAs could meet minimum value. And as soon as you established that HRAs could meet minimum value, how to figure out how to code them, right? And so most of the coding activity since 2022, as far as additional codes into the instructions, have been in this area of HRAs. If you don't use an HRA, you can kind of ignore the next few minutes of this conversation. But if you do, please note the new codes that you can use. Also, just so that everybody's thinking about it, and Pauline, I think my notes are in the next slide. If you could go on to the next one. Yeah, so 1 second. Right. So here are all of the other codes that are related to HRAs, and all of you will notice this reference to zip code, affordability, safe harbors. if you aren't familiar with the, everybody should be familiar at this point in time with the W-2, the FPL, the rate of pay safe harbors, right? So for HRAs, right, for the purpose of the zip code safe harbor, an employer uses the cost of the self-only coverage for the lowest cost silver plan on the exchange, either where the primary site of employment is or where the primary residence of the employee is. This kind of ability to choose between the two is all a recognition. We feel that COVID has made it so that a lot of people were working remotely. And so, there's been a lot of recognition of that. And so giving employers the opportunity to choose between the two has kind of given them the ability to work with the idea that you might have somebody remote in another state where affordability is different, and you're allowed to use your site for it. Whereas you also might have somebody remote who you would prefer to use the affordability of their location, right? Again, if you need any questions specifically about any individual one of these codes, I don't want to get bogged down in HRAs too much, as this is usually a fairly niche area. We don't have too many clients we see using these. If you are and you have any questions about them, please throw it in the Q&A and I'll try to address it at the end. Could go on the next slide. So this is going to be the biggest shocker, I think, to everybody, right? Obviously, for all of our affordability safe harbors, W-2, FPL, and rate of pay. We have been looking at affordability thresholds of anywhere between 9.5 and 9.83%. Well, for 2023, that is dropping down to 9.12%. Why? We believe it has a lot to do with the fact that, as we mentioned previously in the presentation, the IRS, the Inflation Reduction Act has capped the amount that an individual can pay at 8.5%. And why those numbers don't match up completely, I think, is just the IRS recognizing that if they dropped the affordability percentage from 9.61 all the way down to 8.5, that would be really, really difficult for employers, right? But I do think this affordability percentage at this rate, or even slightly lower, is probably here to stay. As long as they're capping employer contributions on the exchange at 8.5%, that's almost an indication of exactly what the government thinks affordability should be. So I think, moving forward, we can expect the affordability percentages to be this low. And again, what does that mean? That means that there's going to be increased pressure on any of you that are using affordability safe harbors to avoid and or prevent those employees of yours that are getting PTCs from resulting in penalties. So again, greater emphasis, more PTCs, and less of an opportunity to utilize some of the safe harbors based upon affordability. Next slide, please. So as everybody's well aware, the individual mandate got zeroed out in 2019. As a result of that happening, though, several states and the District of Columbia kind of stepped into the void. And so for many of you, there is now, and has been for the last couple of years, a state reporting requirement. I'm going to go through these state reporting requirements relatively quickly. If you guys have any specific questions for me in them, please go over and drop them in the Q&A, and we can go over them at the end of the presentation. All right, so California reporting, right? Employers sponsoring health coverage in California for resident Californians need to comply with the state level reporting. It's in addition to the IRS. They must be filed with the California Franchise Tax Board. So it's just an extra filing exercise. Nice part is it's the identical information that you're already doing from a federal level. It's just making sure that you get it to California, and also that you recognize that there might be different deadlines associated with the different filings. And we've got a little chart for you at the end of the presentation that you'll be able to see that kind of gives you those different deadlines to work with. Next slide, Pauline. Right, in New Jersey, right, it's again an additional state level reporting requirement. And again, iteration, it's in addition to filing with the IRS. Fully insured employers can only avoid reporting if they ensure compliance with their insurer reporting. Fully insured employers that participate in a multi-employer plan can avoid reporting only if they ensure compliance with reporting by the plan sponsor. Next slide, please. Oops. Again, 4 states in DC, similar reporting requirement to the other states. You're required to file your Form 1095B or 1095C. It applies to the same coverage of, at least 50 full-time employees, including 1 DC employee or resident, right? And that's one of the keys you have to understand about DC. And the others is that you don't have to have all of your employees in that state to trigger the requirement. Often, if you have 1 employee in that state, and you have over the threshold number of employees, they're going to expect you to file with the state. Rhode Island, right? So all employers offering MAC to state employees must submit state level reporting to track compliance. Again, the requirement is very similar to the federal requirement. The forms are very similar, and we'll track the deadlines for you guys in a slide at the end of this. Massachusetts, as everybody, at least in Massachusetts, is aware that Massachusetts' reporting requirement actually predated the Affordable Care Act, and so it is slightly different, right? It's a slightly different form. It's a slightly different type of reporting that you're doing. All of these states that implemented this post 2019 kind of followed the IRS reporting structure as far as the type of information, even allowing you to a certain degree to use the exact same forms. Massachusetts is different, but I'm expecting that most of you that are in Massachusetts or have a presence there are probably well aware and familiar with this. If you have any additional questions, please let us know. Here are the different deadlines for furnishing, as well as electronic filing for the different states, as well as the deadlines for 2022 for your IRS filings put up top. So we're at the end of kind of my slide part of the presentation. It looks like I've got about 12 or more Q&A questions. So hopefully I'll have enough time to get through all of those before we're done here. But just as a reminder, the ACA compliance is complex, right? There are a lot of moving parts, especially right now as you have the affordability percentage decreasing, you have the number of individuals that are going to be on the exchange increasing, and you're getting less flexibility from the IRS regarding filing deadlines. So we're anticipating, and we have seen already, outside of this in 2021 and 2020, an increase, especially in the late filing and furnishing penalties. The IRS is being a lot more stringent on those than it has been in the past, and really emphasizing the fact that they're not going to let you out of those penalties absent some form of reasonable cause. So that puts just a little bit extra pressure on everybody to get the filings done on time and get the furnishing done on time, such that you can minimize your exposure to those penalties, which could stack up quite a bit. And then obviously with the increased number of individuals on the exchange, the lowering of the threshold to receive a PTC, you're going to end up in a situation, a lot of employers, where your employees are getting PTCs. And so that means your monthly compliance of making sure you're making offers of coverage on time, and then that you're actually coding everybody correctly at the end of the day, and that you're picking the right coverage that does meet your duties to provide something that meets MEC and minimum value in order to avoid some of those B penalties. As a reminder, always, Trusaic is here. If any of you need assistance, we provide a full suite of ACA compliance related products. We do basic reporting, which means we'll just take your information at the end of the year and help put it together into the forms as needed. We also provide a monthly tracking service for those employers that want to make sure that they're making offers of coverage and managing their potential B penalty exposure throughout the year prior to filing. We are integrated with most major HCM platforms for those enterprise customers that need it. Also, if you're in a position where you are getting any of these penalty letters, you're getting a 5699, you've gotten a 5005A or a 972CG, 226J, we do audit-related services associated with helping individuals, companies prepare responses to those letters. We can also redo your coding in the sense of running all of your numbers again and making sure that you actually coded your individuals correctly and potentially recode those individuals and hopefully reduce your penalty amounts. Okay.
And then before we start our Q&A, I'm going to launch one last poll question. In the case that any of you would like to receive a personalized demo on our ACA Complete product, give me one moment to launch the poll. Looks like we're still collecting responses, so I'm going to give it a couple more seconds. All right. Thank you guys for your responses. And now we will go ahead and start the Q&A. So we have quite a few questions, Maxfield. So I'll go ahead and read them off, and then we'll get through as many as we can. We should have enough time to get through all the questions, but if not, we'll definitely answer them in email form. So the first question is what code you use for intern and employees with an F1 visa?
So anybody who's eligible to work, there's no separate coding depending upon how their work eligibility came about. So you wouldn't code somebody who's here on a valid F1 visa any differently than you would code somebody on a green card or somebody who just is an American citizen working for you.
All right. And then if an employee goes to the exchange while they're in assessment period, are they still liable to receive a penalty for PTC?
So if they're in a valid limited non-assessment period, that coding should prevent you from receiving a penalty associated with that PTC month. So the answer is no, you shouldn't receive a penalty as long as you've coded them correctly on their 1095-C that they were in a limited non-assessment period for that period of time.
Okay, great. And how would an employer know if an employee received a PTC?
I kind of hinted at this earlier. The only time you're really going to know is if your employee volunteers it to you, or you end up getting a penalty letter, a letter 226J, which Felicia, that's great that you haven't gotten one, because in that letter, it'll actually identify all of the employees you have that have received a PTC and which months, at least which months that their PTC associated with it resulted in them getting a penalty.
Okay, great. And what happens if my employee receives a premium tax credit? Will I get a penalty?
So not necessarily. The fact that your employee received a PTC, a premium tax credit, doesn't mean you will get a penalty for it. What it does mean is that the IRS is then going to turn to how you coded that individual on their 1095-C, right? And they're going to look at that coding and go, is this coding sufficient to avoid a B penalty, right? Where they made an offer of coverage that met MAC and minimum value, so minimum essential coverage that met minimum value, and was it affordable, right? Under one of the three safe harbors, right? Or were they a part-time employee, right? Were they in a limited non-assessment period during that period of time? There are a number of different codings in that 1095-C that would relieve you of any potential penalty exposure associated with that particular PTC month. And that's why the coding on your 1095-Cs is so important. We get a lot of clients that'll come to us with these penalty letters, and honestly, we'll go through their coding, and it's their exposure was due to their employees being incorrectly coded on their 1095-Cs, not because the employer had done anything wrong. You know, they coded somebody as simply being employed without identifying the fact that they were part-time. Well, that person got a PTC, and because the IRS can't guess whether or not that person's part-time, right? They got a penalty letter, right? So this is why it's so important to have the correct coding on your 1095-Cs, because you don't know what months your employee may or may not receive a PTC, and your ability to prevent yourself from needing to go through the exercise of, say, hiring somebody like us to correct your coding, and then prepare a response to the IRS to kind of eliminate that penalty, is going to be based upon doing it correctly on the front end.
And does your company actually consult one-on-one with companies to make sure that the company is using the correct codes on their 1095-Cs?
So our ACA complete package includes the assignment of a client services associate to you. That client service associate serves several different clients, but you have a direct line to that person. And you would be uploading your data on a monthly basis with us. We'd be preparing a monthly report for you to go over both your offers of coverage and your overall potential B penalty and or A penalty exposure if you're not offering coverage to enough of your employees such that you meet that 95% threshold. And yeah, we're going to go through and take a detailed look throughout the year at how your employees should be coded, and then work with you at the end of the year to make sure that we're coding them correctly, and that by the time we're filing that you're not going to get a penalty. And just so you know, we do include in our ACA complete package for no additional charge that we will prepare a response to the IRS for you to send in. We do that audit preparation response included in the package because we stand behind the work that we do throughout the year with you, such that we're not going to charge you extra should you end up getting a letter 226J from the IRS proposing a penalty. Of course, the caveat there is if throughout the year we've been telling you you have a $20,000 penalty exposure and then you get a 226J for $20,000, it might be one of those things where it's an unavoidable penalty. But if you're using our service, at the very least, you will have known throughout the year that you had that potential exposure.
And does the affordability rate regarding the departments and family glitch make it necessary for us to make our department premium affordable? And then there's a part 2 to this question as well.
So the employee doesn't necessarily get a PTC, right? But what you have to remember is that you, right, might have, right, because dependents and spouses, right, is kind of interchangeable. And so you might be employing a dependent and or spouse, right? So how this all pans out as far as who's going to be assigned the PTC is something that's going to be, you know, moving forward into the next year. I'll be watching it intensely, right? Does this mean that in order to avoid a penalty associated with a PTC that you have to make it affordable to everybody? you can be doing for your own employees exactly what you were doing before as far as affordability is concerned. The reality, though, is that more individuals are on the exchange getting PTCs because they've kind of closed that glitch that has allowed PTCs to get extended out. So we're just going to see, with more individuals getting more PTCs, more potential penalties associated with them. And so that just means that if your employee happens to be the spouse of somebody and they got a PTC associated with being that person's spouse, as long as you were offering them something affordable as you would have been before, you should be fine.
And does the employee, you may have touched on this, but does the employee get a penalty if the dependents do get a PTC?
The employee is not. So here's the caveat, right? So if the dependent got a PTC, chances are the employee got a PTC, right? They're not going to give a PTC to the dependent if they didn't already give one to the employee, right? So if you're a dependent of somebody got a PTC and they're a dependent of your employee, then it's a guarantee that your employee got a PTC as well.
Okay, great. And then does the family glitch impact IRS reporting?
The family glitch isn't going to really impact your reporting. It's more going to impact the potential PTCs that are out there, right? And so just so everybody thinks about this, right? And I know it's a little confusing. It's that the PTC is just the trigger. It's like the 95% threshold, right? So if you don't offer 95%, right, you are potentially now exposed to an A penalty, right? But if there's no PTC listed individual, there will be no penalty assessed, right? And so again, with the B penalty, right, you could, in theory, have 1,000 employees and not offer them minimum essential coverage that offers minimum value. If none of your employees goes on the exchange and tries to get insurance and gets a PTC, then your penalty exposure would still be zero. They don't assess a penalty based upon your coverage not meeting minimum value or not being affordable, right? They assess it based upon an employee receiving a PTC, and then it triggers all of those other things.
Great. And if we offer an HRA, are we required to use one of these HRA offer of coverage codes?
So not necessarily, right? You'll see that all of these new HRA offer codes are essentially identifying that zip code safe harbor, right? So if you're using a different type of coding, because the IRS has made it clear that as long as it meets a specific threshold, that the HRA is an offer of coverage that meets minimum essential coverage and minimum value. So you can use some of the other coding. If you're going to end up using those zip code safe harbors to improve affordability of your HRA, then you're going to have to use one of the new codes.
Okay, great. And this will be this individual's first year conducting this reporting, but they're curious why zip code affordability is determined when they have multiple employees that live outside of their company's zip code.
So is it why zip code? So I'm going to answer two questions here just to make sure that I'm answering the correct one. So zip code affordability is determined under these coding in one of two ways, right? Either it's based upon where the office is, right? Or where the employee is. And so as an exercise for you, it might be most simple if you have employees all over the place to focus and just look at the affordability based upon where your office is, right? That just might simplify your reporting. If you have 1,000 employees that are all in 100 different zip codes, the exercise of figuring out what your affordability threshold for each of those different 100 zip codes might be too difficult, right? You might want to just stick with your office location and base your premiums or your costs on that affordability, right? Versus trying to do 100 different zip codes. Now, the trade-off on that is that, if you have a bunch of employees in 2 or 3 zip codes, those zip codes might have a lower threshold of affordability that you want to be able to take advantage of over your office location. And so that's just something you might want to look into depending upon the sheer number of zip codes you're dealing with.
Thank you so much. And just a clarifying question here, is the California state reporting new for this year?
No, California state reporting has been around since 2020.
Thank you. And do you happen to have the filing deadlines for 2023 off the top of your head?
So the filing deadlines for the 2023 reporting year, I don't have off the top of my head. We
Okay.
did, if you're referring to the filing deadline in 2023 for 2022, then they're actually in the slides here.
Okay, wonderful. And for the state filing requirements, can you repeat what you said about filing requirements if an employer, only one employee in California or New Jersey, for instance, do they have to file with state they're required, if they're required to file, required to file federally?
So all of the states require that if you have enough employees and you have a presence within the state, that you do file within that state.
Okay.
So it's not that you have to have 50 employees in New Jersey or 50 employees. It's if you're a big enough employer and you already have the filing requirement.
Wonderful. And this is a little bit more of an individual question, but for the first time, this organization has a remote employee in Massachusetts. What do they need to know to be able to file for him?
So the Massachusetts requirement, so you do trigger it again, because all you have to do is have one employee in Massachusetts, as long as you have at least 6 employees. But it's a very different form. It's the Massachusetts Form 1099 HC. It's similar to a Form 1095B. You submit it to the Department of Revenue, but you just need to pull out that one form. It should be relatively simple for you because you have one employee. But again, if you have any questions about the Massachusetts form, I'll tell you, it's so simple that we don't have a ton of clients that have any interest in us doing it for them, because it's often a relatively simple exercise.
And who should be handling the ACA filing for the company? Should the payroll service used be completing the filing for federal and state, or is this a function of HR? Where we see employers doing it in-house, they are doing it through their HR departments for the most part. I do know some payroll vendors that will tack this on as an added service. Also, some HRIS platforms will tack this on as an added service if you use ADP or some of the others. A lot of those big HRS services will allow you to pick between several vendors. And then you have standalone companies like us that would do it on your behalf. So it just depends upon, one, your internal comfort level associated with tracking your offers of coverage, making sure that the plans you're offering meet the affordability thresholds, and then also completing the forms at the end of the year. We find that a lot of companies, especially those that have high rates of turnover and or tons of seasonal employees, it's often better to bring in an outside company that does this a lot, because it can get relatively confusing as to whether you even have a reporting requirement and how you're going to code those individuals that maybe only work for you for 3 months out of the year. Now, how does this apply to small employer groups, so those under 51 employees?
So the employer mandate applies to any employer that has 50 or more full-time employees and or equivalents. So if you are truly a company that employs 49 individuals and you only have 49 individuals on payroll, whether they're all full-time or a mix of full and part-time, then you would not be an applicable large employer, right? If you're not an applicable large employer, then you have no filing requirement. And so just so you know, your determination of whether or not you're an applicable large employer and therefore subject to the filing requirement is done in the year prior, right? So you would have had to have averaged 50 or more full-time employees and or their equivalents in the year 2021 to be subject to the 2022 filing requirement, right? If you reach that threshold in 2022, then you'd be subject to the 2023 filing requirement. And we have a number of clients that sit around that threshold, and we actually do the work for them every year as far as like helping them track it and then determine, hey, maybe some years they don't need our services because they've dropped below the threshold in a particular year. So that next year they have no filing requirement. They still provide us with their employee numbers and counts throughout the next year so that we can help them determine whether or not they trigger the filing requirement for the following year.
Great, thank you. And can you ask employees to know who is getting a PTC, or is that against the law?
Absolutely not. I would please don't ask your employees. It would be highly, some of them might not mind, but you could get into a significant amount of trouble.
Thank you for that. And if employees' working hours vary, some weeks are over 30, some weeks are less, is it okay to keep changing codes depending on the number of hours worked?
Yes, your employees are not necessarily static, right? They may be full-time one month, they may be part-time another month, as far as the total number of hours that they work. You do have to be aware of, requirements as far as if they meet certain, full-time thresholds, as far as number of months that they've been full-time, that it triggers a requirement that you have offered them coverage at a certain point in time. So this is why tracking is incredibly important, to make sure that you're tracking the number of hours that your employees are working, such that if they do work full-time for enough of a period of time that it does trigger that you've actually made the offer of coverage in time.
Now, following up to the HRA codes, this organization, we have two types of HRAs, one employer-funded HRA, and two a rewards HRA where employees earn funds that are then applied to an HRA. So does it matter what kind of HRA the organization offers when looking at these new HRA codes?
Yeah, so your biggest question is really the question of whether or not your HRA, right, is such an HRA that it is that it meets the requirements of the IRS. And here, let me see if I put in my notes the exact IRS language. I might not have. Yeah. Yeah, I didn't put the exact IRS language in my notes, and I don't know it off of the top of my head. But if you shoot Pauline and or us an email, I can direct you to exactly the language that will give you an idea of whether or not your HRA actually qualifies as an HRA that is meeting MEC and minimum value. And that's going to be your differentiating factor. My guess is that number one, your employer funded HRA is likely the one that is going to meet the threshold. I'm not sure if your rewards HRA is going to meet the threshold such that it is an offer of MEC that meets minimum value.
Okay. And why is ACA affordability so low for 2023? Does this have anything to do with the Inflation Reduction Act?
Yeah, well, so it's not directly tied to that, but as I said, it does feel like it is tied to them capping the amount an individual would pay on the exchange to 8.5%, right? So that 8.5% has really sent a signal that the government looks at 8.5% as the affordability threshold. right? And so if your plan is costing 9.5%, but your employee can go on the exchange and get a plan that is similar or identical, that's going to cost 8.5%, right? That truly incentivizes them to go on the exchange. One. And so the follow-up question is why didn't the IRS just drop its affordability percentage to 8.5%? The IRS put some language in one of their most recent announcements that essentially said they didn't feel like they needed to go all the way down there, just because getting close enough was going to achieve the effect that was needed. But we really do believe that they dropped it mostly in part due to the Inflation Reduction Act's pegging of the affordability on the exchange at 8.5%.
Thank you. And does our family premium have to meet affordability or just the employee premium in order to avoid a PTC?
It's the employee premium that you're looking at.
Okay, great. If someone is termed for a while and then rehired again, when do they start offering coverage?
That is a complex calculation. And it depends completely upon what you mean by a while. There are several rules associated with employees that you had brought on and then let go and then brought back as to how that's triggered. And it would be probably a complex conversation that we really don't have enough time to go through right now. If you have more questions on that, you can please feel free to reach out to us. We also have some great articles, honestly, on that on our ACA Times website, or in the ACA Times on our website, where we kind of go through the rules associated with employees coming on and off. We wrote several of those early on in the pandemic, in part because there were a lot of employers that were letting people go, but then bringing them back when it looked like things were going to open up, and they had a lot of questions regarding this exact scenario.
Great, thank you. And we have time for about 2 more questions. So how do you code an employee who waives insurance?
How do you code an employee who waives insurance? So you would indicate that you made an offer of coverage. There's several codes associated with saying, yes, I made an offer of coverage to my employee. The fact that they waived the insurance isn't something that's necessarily relevant to the IRS. What you would be doing is saying, I made an offer of coverage and then subsequently in your 2 series coding, indicate whether or not that offer of coverage met MEC and minimum value and an affordability safe harbor or something to that extent. All you have to do in your 1 series coding in that situation is indicate that you made the offer of coverage, unless of course you're using the FPL safe harbor, in which case that you would just be saying we made an offer of coverage that was affordable under FPL, and that's just the code of 1A.
Okay, great. And then last question before we wrap up. What happens if we're a few days late on submitting IRS filing electronically?
Hold your breath. I have yet to see a 972 CG, and just to give you guys an idea of these numbers of these letters we're sending out. So the 972 CG letter is the letter sent out by the IRS to somebody who has filed, but filed late, to say, hey, we're proposing a penalty on you because you filed late. I have yet to see a 972 CG sent out for somebody that was like a week late, 2 weeks late. That's not to say that we're not going to start seeing stuff like that coming up. But usually the 972 CGs that we have seen, the company was a month late, 2 months late. Again, that's not to say that you should, relax and not try to meet the deadline. You should definitely try to meet the deadline. And if you can't meet the deadline, you should, request an extension as you can underneath the ACA rules to potentially get your deadline extended. But you should definitely try to meet that deadline, because again, as we pointed out earlier in the presentation, there are significant resources being handed to the IRS to step up enforcement. And And we just feel like that's going to mean increased scrutiny on everything, but especially on the ACA, and probably less flexibility with some of these deadlines, which will likely result in increased penalties.
Thank you so much, Maxfield. Before we wrap up, we weren't able to get to all of the questions, but we will be addressing them through email. And we will possibly be sending out just a Q&A doc to make sure you guys got all of your questions answered. As we stated in the beginning of the webinar, we will be sending a copy of the slides along with a recording of this presentation. And should you have any questions about the webinar or would like resources or any more information, please email us at discover@trusaic.com. Thank you, Maxfield, for your time, and thank you all for attending. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.